Vice Consul Threl Amasi had spent 11 years studying human linguistic patterns before his posting to Earth's diplomatic quarter, and he considered himself, by any reasonable measure, fluent in humanity's most commonly used phrases. It took him 4 months on assignment to realize that the 2 words he understood best were the 2 words he understood least of all. "I'm fine." He first noticed the discrepancy during a routine briefing with his human counterpart, a mid-level trade coordinator named James Whitmore, 3 weeks after Threl's arrival at the Geneva diplomatic compound. James had arrived to their scheduled meeting 15 minutes late, his eyes carrying a faint redness Threl's species associated with recent tear production, his movements slightly slower than the brisk efficiency that had characterized their previous 4 meetings. "You appear to be experiencing some form of distress," Threl observed, consulting the behavioral analysis protocols his diplomatic training had emphasized as essential for accurate cross-species communication. "Are you unwell?" "I'm fine," James said, opening his data slate with the same practiced efficiency as always, his voice carrying no apparent strain. "Just didn't sleep great. Let's get through the tariff schedule. I've got a lot on my plate today." They proceeded through the meeting's agenda without further comment on the matter, and Threl, trusting the verbal report his linguistic training had taught him to accept at face value, filed the observation away as a minor and irrelevant data point. James Whitmore had stated, clearly and directly, that he was fine. Threl's diplomatic protocols placed considerable weight on taking human verbal communication at its literal meaning, a principle that had served him reliably across 11 years of xenolinguistic study. He learned 3 days later, through an unrelated administrative notification, that James Whitmore's father had died the morning of that meeting, roughly 90 minutes before their scheduled briefing began. The discovery unsettled Threl considerably more than the diplomatic protocols his training had prepared him to expect. He requested an emergency consultation with the compound senior cultural liaison, a decades-experienced diplomat named Dr. Sarah Voss, presenting the discrepancy with the particular precision his species brought to problems that violated their expected analytical frameworks. "He told me he was fine," Threl said, laying out the timeline with methodical care. "His father had died 90 minutes earlier. By any behavioral metric my training has taught me to recognize, he was demonstrating clear indicators of significant emotional distress, and yet when directly questioned about his well-being, he provided verbal confirmation that contradicted every observable indicator. I do not understand how to reconcile this discrepancy within any communication framework. My 11 years of study have prepared me to navigate." Dr. Voss, who had spent considerably longer than 11 years navigating exactly this kind of cross-species confusion, offered Threl a patient smile that carried, he would later come to understand, its own small demonstration of the exact phenomenon he was struggling to comprehend. "Welcome to one of the more complicated corners of human communication, Vice Consul," she said. "I'm fine" is probably the most commonly misunderstood phrase in our entire language, and honestly, we misunderstand it among ourselves half the time too. It doesn't mean what it says. Not exactly. Not usually. "Then what does it mean?" Threl asked, genuine confusion entering his translated voice. Dr. Voss considered the question with the weight it deserved, recognizing, correctly, that a proper answer would require considerably more than a simple linguistic definition. "It means a lot of different things, depending on who's saying it and why," she said. "Sometimes it means exactly what it says, that the person actually is fine and you're worrying over nothing. But a lot of the time, especially in a professional context like your meeting with James, it means something closer to, 'I am not fine, but I don't have the capacity right now to explain why. And I need you to respect that I've chosen not to make this your problem in this particular moment.' It's not dishonesty exactly, even though it sounds like it should be. It's more like a boundary, a way of saying this is mine to carry right now, not yours, without actually having to explain the whole complicated reason why. Threll spent the following weeks observing human communication patterns with renewed and considerably more nuanced attention, cataloging instances of the phrase across dozens of contexts, gradually developing a more sophisticated understanding of the layered social function it appeared to serve within human interaction. He observed a colleague at the compound's cafeteria respond, "I'm fine," to a question about a visibly bandaged hand, only to learn later that the injury had required 6 stitches and considerable pain. The colleague had simply declined to discuss during a brief lunch encounter with someone she did not consider close enough to burden with the details. He observed a security officer respond, "I'm fine," when asked about a recent divorce that compound gossip suggested had been considerably more difficult than the officer's calm demeanor indicated. He observed, with growing analytical interest, that the phrase seemed to function less as a factual report and more as a kind of social signal, one whose actual meaning depended almost entirely on context, relationship, and a complex web of unstated social calculations that no dictionary definition could adequately capture. "I believe I am beginning to understand the phrase's function," he told Dr. Voss during a follow-up consultation 2 months into his study. "But I confess, I do not yet understand why your species has developed such an elaborate linguistic convention, specifically designed to obscure rather than communicate emotional state. My own species places considerably greater value on direct emotional transparency. We do not generally develop linguistic mechanisms specifically intended to conceal distress from those who inquire about it." "I don't think it's really about concealment," Dr. Voss said, settling into the same patient, thoughtful posture she had brought to their first conversation on the subject. "I think it's more about control, about choosing when and how and to whom you're willing to be vulnerable. Humans go through a lot of hard things, vice consul, over the course of a normal life, more than most people outside our species probably fully appreciate. If we were fully, transparently honest about our internal state every single time somebody asked how we were doing, most of us would spend an enormous amount of our daily interactions processing grief or stress or fear. With people who aren't actually equipped to help us with it, or who don't have the relationship with us that would make that kind of vulnerability appropriate. I'm fine lets us keep functioning, keep the day moving forward without pretending those harder feelings don't exist. It's not really a lie. It's more like permission. Permission for both people in the conversation to keep going without either of them having to fully unpack something that isn't the right moment or the right relationship for unpacking." Threll considered this explanation with the careful analytical attention his species brought to concepts that challenged their established understanding. "You are suggesting the phrase functions as a form of emotional labor management," he said slowly. "A linguistic tool that allows your species to continue essential daily function despite carrying, frequently, considerable unaddressed emotional burden." "That's a more clinical way of putting it than I would have chosen," Dr. Voss said. "But yes, essentially. We can't stop and process every hard thing the moment it happens, not if we want to keep functioning as a society. So we developed a phrase that lets us signal, I'm carrying something right now, but I'm choosing to keep carrying it privately, and I need you to trust that choice without pushing me to explain it, the trick. And I think this is the part that probably confused you most, is that the people who actually care about you learn to hear what's underneath it. They don't just accept the words at face value the way your training taught you to. They notice the tone, the timing, the context, and they learn when I'm fine actually means please ask me again more gently, because I want to tell you but I don't know how to start, versus when it means I genuinely need you to respect this boundary and not push further right now. It's a whole unspoken language layered underneath 2 very simple words, and most humans spend their entire lives getting better at reading it, in the people they're closest to." Threll Amassi's understanding of the phrase deepened considerably over the following months. Through a series of increasingly personal encounters, that gradually transformed his purely academic linguistic study into something considerably more consequential. He began noticing the specific quality of James Whitmore's "I'm fine" during their continued weekly briefings, learning to distinguish between the brisk, genuine version delivered on ordinary days and a different, slightly flatter version that emerged on the anniversary of difficult dates, a distinction his original training would never have equipped him to recognize. He found himself, 4 months into his posting, sitting across from James during a briefing that had run unusually long, watching the trade coordinator's shoulders carry a particular tension Threll had, by that point, learned to associate with the flatter, more guarded version of the phrase. "You appear to be carrying something today," Threll said, choosing his words with considerably more care than his original diplomatic training had emphasized. "I am not asking you to explain what it is, unless you wish to. I am simply telling you that I have noticed, and that I am available if you would find it useful to talk, or equally available if you would prefer that I simply continue with the agenda and allow you the privacy to carry it however you've chosen to carry it." James Whitmore looked up from his data slate with an expression Threll's species would have classified, under his original training, as mild surprise, though he had by then developed sufficient nuance to recognize it as something closer to quiet, unexpected gratitude. "Today's the anniversary," James said after a long moment. "My dad's death, 4 years now. I usually just push through these meetings and deal with it later on my own time. Didn't expect you to pick up on that." "I did not initially," Threll admitted. "I have spent considerable time over the past 4 months attempting to understand a phrase that, on my arrival here, I believed I already fully comprehended. I have concluded that I did not understand it at all. I understand it somewhat better now, though I suspect, based on everything Dr. Voss has explained to me, that genuine understanding of this particular phrase may take considerably longer than 4 months to fully develop." James allowed himself a small, tired smile, the first genuine expression of warmth Threll had observed from him during that particular meeting. "That's probably the most human thing I've ever heard an alien diplomat say," he said. "Took me until I was about 30 to really get it myself, and I grew up speaking the language. You want to actually talk about it, or you want to just get through the tariff schedule and let me deal with the rest later like usual?" "Whichever you prefer," Threll said. "I am equally prepared for either option. That, I believe, is the part I finally understand. The phrase was never actually about the words themselves. It was about the choice underneath them and about trusting the person asking to honor whichever choice you make." James Whitmore chose, that particular afternoon, to talk, spending 20 minutes describing a father he rarely discussed with colleagues, a conversation considerably more personal than anything their professional relationship had previously included. Threll listened with the same careful, patient attention Dr. Voss had modeled for him months earlier, offering no analysis, no diplomatic protocol, simply the quiet, attentive presence that his months of study had finally taught him mattered considerably more than any linguistic precision ever could. Threll Amassi's final diplomatic report on human communication patterns, submitted 18 months into his posting, and eventually incorporated into his species' broader cultural liaison training materials, contained a passage that would become, within his own government's diplomatic corps, one of the most frequently referenced insights into humanity's complex emotional culture. "I arrived on Earth believing that accurate cross-species communication required precise, literal comprehension of verbal statements," he wrote. "I have since concluded that this assumption, while reasonable within my own species' communication framework, fundamentally misunderstands a significant portion of human linguistic practice, one built not around literal accuracy, but around a sophisticated, largely unspoken negotiation of trust, privacy, and emotional boundary that exists in the space between what is said and what is actually meant. The phrase 'I'm fine,' which I initially cataloged as a simple factual report, in fact represents one of the most complex social mechanisms I have encountered in 11 years of xenolinguistic study. A phrase whose true function has almost nothing to do with its literal words, and everything to do with the relationship, context, and unspoken trust between the two people exchanging it. I do not believe accurate diplomatic communication with humanity is possible through literal translation alone. I believe it requires something my own species' communication culture has perhaps never specifically required us to develop to this degree. The patient, sustained attention necessary to hear what a person is choosing not to say, and the equally important patience to respect their choice not to say it, until they decide, in their own time and on their own terms, that they are ready to. He concluded his report with a final observation that Dr. Sarah Voss would later describe, in her own commentary appended to the document, as the single most accurate summary of human emotional communication she had encountered from any external observer in her considerable career. Humans do not say, "I'm fine," because they believe it will be understood as literally true, Threll wrote. They say it because it allows them to keep moving forward through days that would otherwise become impossible to navigate, while quietly trusting that the people who matter most to them will learn over time to hear the difference between the fine that means fine and the fine that means not yet, but thank you for asking, and please ask me again. I spent 11 years studying this species' language before I ever set foot on their world. I did not begin to understand it until I learned to listen for the words they were choosing not to say.